I have a cold, so my voice is not perfect, but I will try. So, the Middle East, I can say that the Middle East and North Africa have been of interest to human civilizations for centuries. Hello, Przemek. We are started for centuries. The Middle East is home to three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All those religions believe in the same God. Faith means hope. Today we are to discuss new hope and challenges. We are going to talk about COVID. We are going to talk about the regional conflicts. We are going to talk about Lebanon. We are going to talk about Syria. We are going also to talk about powerful countries in the region like Iran or Turkey. We will also devote our attention to them. As I decided when I know that TAFL wouldn't come, and we didn't know what's going on with our colleague from Iran, we will have, all of you will have minimum 15 minutes for your presentations. So the first topic is COVID. So Professor Sultan Ali, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And I would like to actually share the screen with a PowerPoint presentation, if it's all right with you.
Okay, just do it.
I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, so the topic assigned to me is the COVID-19 and its course in the region. I will not go into the details of the COVID-19 because it has hit each one of us in a terrible manner, and nearly every country has suffered, irrespective of being powerful or being underdeveloped or whatever. But I will talk about the region, and the sequence of my talk will be, I will initially discuss a little bit about China, then India, Iran, Afghanistan, and finally a bit about Pakistan. And I'll share my thoughts with you based upon the facts and figures. So let's talk about China first. In the year since the coronavirus began its march around the world, China has what most countries could not do. Its Communist Party reached deep down into the private sector and brought the population in a people's war against the pandemic and won. Of course, there are, you see, aspersions that it was first discovered in Wuhan and China was late in announcing it and so on. I will not go into the politics, but one fact remains that China put in a lot of effort to control it. And at least as far as its own country is concerned, it won the war against the pandemic. Now, the success of China has positioned it well, both economically and diplomatically. And President Xi Jinping has offered China's experience as a model for others to follow. Now, some countries made full use of China's largesse and its offer for the cooperation. Some people looked upon it with criticism, but that's besides the point. But ours is a country which benefited immensely from China, but that I'll come to a little later. Now, the Chinese outlook, I would like to emphasize on that. It comprised active case surveillance, a rapid case diagnosis and management, a strict follow-up and quarantine of persons with close contacts, and issuance of guidance to help the public understand and adhere to control measures, plus prompt and effective high-level policy decision, complete activation of the public health system, and full involvement of the Chinese society. Now, along with the measures, the population shift levels, daily local new diagnosed cases, and mortality were decreased, and the daily local new cured cases, they shot up in China, which was a very positive sign. Now, I'm saying some of this based upon experience because my son was studying in the university at Wuhan, and most of the information was gleaned firsthand. But please remember that China's practices are effective in controlling the transmission of the pandemic, considering the newly occurred situation like imported cases, work resumption, the control measures could be adjusted. Now I'll talk a little bit about the course of the COVID-19 in India, which is next door neighbor to Pakistan. And according to official figures, India has the second highest number of confirmed cases in the world after the USA, with nearly 5 million cases reported of COVID-19 infection, and the third highest number of deaths after the US and Brazil at nearly 50,000 or so. However, these figures should be taken with a pinch of salt because the media in India itself reports that there has been serious under-reporting. Indian government, which is progressive, it claimed in October 2020 that the pandemic had peaked in India and it would be under control by February 2021. Unfortunately, a new variant, the Delta variant, was unleashed in India, which not only created a havoc in India, but also affected more or less the entire world, and especially India's neighbors, including Pakistan. Multiple factors contributed to the sudden spike in the cases, and most of these were because of lack of preparations, as temporary hospitals were set up, but then they were dismantled after the cases started to decline, and no new facilities were built. And when the cases spiked, the facilities, they were not there anymore. So they had to start from scratch, which hampered India's efficient handling of the COVID-19 cases and obviously subscribed to the higher number of deaths. Now, health and safety precautions were being poorly implemented or enforced because permission was given, or rather the government looked the other way, for people participating in weddings, in festivals, in sporting events, as well as state and local elections were held in several states in which the politicians and activists held rallies in public places. Thus, they themselves got infected and infected a number of other people. An economic slowdown put pressure on the government to lift the restrictions. Also, the vaccination program of India was hit with supply issues, although India was manufacturing its own vaccination, but then the shortage of the raw materials required to manufacture the vaccines domestically, they declined. And also there was a hesitancy and lack of knowledge among the poorer and rural communities. Amongst the economic woes, India suffers from a serious problem because it has millions of migrant workers who leave their villages or their hometowns to come and work in the major cities. And when the lockdown was imposed, these migrant workers became unemployed, and thus poverty increased and the livelihoods of the people was affected. Now let me touch upon Iran. I have the figures updated till 6th of December, which was yesterday. The confirmed cases are 6.134 million, while the deaths are 130,200. Now, these are official figures. Somebody could challenge them. I do not know, but I've taken the official figures from WHO. In response to the coronavirus, the Iranian government canceled public events as well as Friday prayers. It closed the schools, universities, shopping centers, bazaars, and also holy shrines, and banned festival celebrations. The economic measures were announced to help families and businesses. Iran was forced to make an unprecedented request for an emergency loan of $5 billion from the International Monetary Fund. Iran, sometime back, it may be recalled, had come out of the burden of debt, but COVID-19 forced it to take a serious debt of $5 billion. Now, the Iranian government initially rejected plans to quarantine entire cities and areas, and heavy traffic between cities continued ahead of Nowruz. Nowruz, by the way, is a very popular Iranian festival, something like Christmas in the Christian world. But despite the government's intention to limit travel, the government later announced a ban on travel between cities following an increase in the number of the new cases. But government restrictions were gradually eased starting in April. The number of new cases in Iran fell to a low on 2nd May, but increased again in May or towards the end of May as restrictions were eased, with a new peak of cases reported on the 4th of June and the new peaks in the number of deaths reported in July. But despite the increase, the Iranian government stated that it had no option but to keep the economy open, which, as you must all be knowing, is under serious strains because of US sanctions. And this saw a decrease or decline in its GDP by a further 15% due to COVID-19. So that was the Iranian experience. Now let me talk about Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been in the news for a number of other reasons, but let me touch upon the cases of or how COVID progressed in Afghanistan. As of 6 December again, that is yesterday, there have been 157,445 confirmed positive cases with 7,312 deaths. Kabul province, Kabul, as we all know by now, because Afghanistan has been in the news so much, is the capital. But the province itself has the highest number of COVID in Afghanistan, followed by Herat with 9,343 cases, while Balkh has 3,431. On 5th August 2020, the Ministry of Public Health in Afghanistan reported that approximately a third of the country's population, or roughly about 10 million people, had contracted COVID-19. Now, in August 2021, and especially I'm talking about the period after the withdrawal of the US as well as the NATO forces, and the Taliban gained control of the government, they banned, I mean, this has been reported by the Shamshad News, so I'm quoting them. They banned the use of COVID-19 vaccines in the Paktia Regional Hospital. And following the fall of Kabul, the World Health Organization, they sent out a report that they feared a potential rapid and uncontrolled spread of COVID-19. Weeks later, COVID-19 tests also decreased by 77%, and COVID-19 vaccinations decreased by 80% compared to the week before. Now, this shows a very bleak situation if the figures are true. On 3rd September 2021, the Taliban announced that China will increase its assistance for the treatment of COVID-19. Meanwhile, we, their next door neighbors, Pakistan, has been constantly providing support, but obviously our support is not enough because Pakistan, as we all know, is itself an economically challenged country. Now let me talk about the course of COVID in my home country, Pakistan. We have, faced the worst of it, but somehow God has been kind to this country, and some of the policies that were adopted helped us that despite being underprivileged and despite being the world's 5th most populous country, Pakistan has so far suffered from the world's 29th highest death toll, that is 28,777. And it also has the 29th number of cases, which is about 1 million, a little over it. Now, Pakistan so far has experienced 3 different waves of COVID-19. The first wave began in late May 2021. It peaked in mid-June, then ended in mid-July. The first wave was marked by a low death rate and passed very suddenly as case and death rates began to drop very quickly after peaking. This, I suppose, was a gift from the Providence. Second wave commenced in early November 2020 and peaked in mid-December 2020. The third wave, however, began in mid-March 2021 and peaked in late April 2021. Now, you see, questions are generally asked, why did Pakistan suffer such a low death rate? Of course, we can always thank Providence, but also a number of policies that were adopted they worked out. The low death rate and confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Pakistan is due to planned but limited nationwide lockdown from 1st April and extended twice until 9th May, ending with ease down in phases, followed by identifying the hotspots and using a term which we call here smart lockdowns, and the SOPs were strictly enforced. Now, some of the steps which were adopted by Pakistan, I would like to share them with you all because perhaps we can learn lessons from it. I hope so. The State Bank of Pakistan took steps to provide disinfected cash to all banks because it was discovered that one of the causes of the spread of COVID-19 was through currency notes. So the State Bank made sure that disinfected cash is being provided to all banks for circulation through their branches. And the banks were asked to quarantine the returning cash for a period of probably 15 days, clean them up, and then only they could redistribute. And bank branches were allowed to close down only if a staff member tested positive or where requisite human resources were not available to avoid congestion or to maintain social distancing. The government also installed a youth force, which was named the Corona Relief Tigers. This comprised of volunteer youth, and they were distributed nationwide. Their task was to help the government combat the coronavirus by supplying food items to people in their houses in the peak periods of COVID-19. These were very brave and very bright young people who must be commended, and they did a tremendous job. Then the lockdowns imposed by the regional governments halted the goods transport system, but the federal government ensured that highways and roads across the country would remain open to ensure the transportation of goods and also increase the number of freight trains to avert a shortage of food and other essential supplies. Also, the Prime Minister asked the provincial governments to take a strict action against hoarders and profiteers who were trying to exploit the ongoing crisis. Of course, there are bad people in every society, and even during the crisis, there were some black marketeers, hoarders, and profiteers. But the Prime Minister asked the provincial governments to crack down on them and make sure that ample food supplies are provided to the people. The State Minister for Health tasked the Higher Education Commission in Pakistan to invite proposals from researchers, scientists, technicians, manufacturers, and other experts to assist the government in its fight against COVID-19. The commission will also promise to provide generous funding to prospective researchers if their ideas are accepted. And I'm glad to note that a number of excellent ideas were presented, especially by our younger generation, and some of these were accepted and they were put into practice. The Ministry of Science and Technology made full use of what the initiative which was taken by the Ministry for Health. The government also announced the creation of a fund to cover all medical expenses of the sports persons because the sports were banned and the sports persons were nearing starvation because they were not receiving any stipends or any money. So a special medical expense was provided for them if they were infected with COVID-19. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting provided protective kits.
3 minutes left, 3 minutes, okay?
Okay, thank you for the reminder. To the journalists covering vulnerable areas, including quarantine centers, and an app called COVID-19 Care for Media to help the journalists affected by the virus was launched. And at the same time, newspaper hawkers, the people who distribute newspapers, were registered in a program called ESAS Emergency Cash Program as part of the economic relief package announced by the federal government, since their sales had also been affected due to the outbreak. Now, in the economic relief package, the Prime Minister approved a figure of rupees 1.2 trillion, of which let's convert it into US dollars. $1 billion was allotted for the low income groups, particularly the laborers, and $1.76 billion was assigned for wheat procurement because bread happens to be the staple food for people in Pakistan, I suppose, like elsewhere in the world. Loan interest payments for exporters were deferred temporarily, while a package of $63 million was provided to support small industries and the agriculture sector. sector. Significant reduction in petroleum prices was ensured so that people could afford to move about easily, and people were also permitted to pay their utility bills in installments so that they would not be burdened. A monthly stipend as relief for the needy, which had already been fixed, was enhanced. The relief package also included a special package for healthcare professionals, according to which if a doctor or a paramedic died while treating coronavirus patients, they would be considered martyrs, and their families would receive packages that is given to martyrs. The government of Pakistan announced that the Pakistani economy had suffered a loss of 2.5 trillion due to the coronavirus pandemic. But some government programs were maintained through the crisis to keep the people employed. These included the Plan for Pakistan Reforestation, as well as the construction industry, and simultaneously border crossing with Afghanistan and India were kept open and were maintained so that landlocked Afghanistan would not suffer. And last but not the least, China's support to Pakistan during COVID-19 crisis has been exemplary in providing medical equipment, vaccines, and continuing the Belt and Road Initiative and China-Pakistan Economic Corridor related projects. The coronavirus vaccines, the number of doses that were administered, the first dose, the second dose, and now the booster dose is also in progress, that you can see the figures on this. That
1 minute, 1 minute.
No, so that is all I had to say. If with your permission, I will conclude with 1 minute to go. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for very interesting presentation. The topic is very important for all of us. I can say that COVID exposed the weakness of the international community. When I'm thinking that we are going to time of Yalta and Tehran. In Yalta and Tehran, the superpower decided about what's going on. But my point is that today, the pharmaceutical companies, countries with access to biotechnology, they decided about the future of our countries, of our civilization. When I'm thinking about India, I remember that it was about 1 year ago, the biggest companies decided that the vaccine will be produced in India because India have had such a huge capacity in biotechnology. So it's still a competition. Thank you very much. The next is, who is the next? Oh, Przemek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Please give us a second so we'll silence the microphone in the classroom.
Okay. It's function.
Okay.
So
I think, yeah, now you can hear me, right? Without echo, right? Okay, yes. So it's better. Okay, so well, my paper is dedicated to the Syrian conflict and the process of internationalization of the conflict, which is unfortunately still ongoing. So, well, I will begin with some remarks. First of all, we have less and less conflicts that take the form of a classic interstate armed conflict. And with regard to that, we can say that more and more conflicts, international conflicts, involve non-state actors, like, for example, terrorist organizations or organizations supported by some states, which are not defined or identified as terrorist organizations. And the number of such conflicts is constantly growing. So that's the world we live in. And these internationalized internal armed conflicts can be defined as the process by which international actors make an informed decision, right, to be involved in a given conflict at any stage of its duration. It means that any such a conflict begins with an internal tensions, with internal clashes, and sometimes at the very beginning, sometimes in the after a few years, some external actors become actively involved in such processes. This can take place both during ongoing hostilities or during, for example, peace negotiations. And we had a few such examples, for example, during the Cold War, including the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s. The main question is how to distinguish a situation in which we can define a conflict as an internationalized internal armed conflict. And there are quite many typologies, there are quite many theoretical approaches to this issue. So, well, I've selected the one proposed by Sven Chojnacki. Well, the name sounds Polish, but he's a German scholar, actually, dealing with international public law. And he defined an internal armed conflict as a conflict which has to meet three criteria. First, foreign intervention for an insurgent group, and in this case, fighting against the established government. Second, armed conflict between two internal non-state groups, both of which are supported by different states. And last but not least, there must be direct hostilities between foreign states that intervene and support one of these or two of these non-international armed sides of the conflict. Well, in my opinion, the Syrian conflict meets all three criteria, and that's why we can analyze it as a case of an internal conflict which has become internationalized. Well, if we were to focus on the causes of this conflict, well, I divided them into two groups, namely internal causes and external causes. In the case of internal causes, well, I specified domestic rivalry. I mean the rivalry between the regime, between President Assad and his followers, and then the opposition, right? However we define it, because, well, as you know, it is really hard even today to define the Syrian opposition. There are so many groups that form this opposition that it's a very hard task to name all these organizations, groups involved in the conflict. One of our colleagues from the faculty, Professor Weixner, wrote a very interesting book about it, and he enlisted more or less 100 organizations which were actively taking part, or which actively were taking part in the conflict, or still are taking part in the conflict, this way or another. Well, the oppressive regime, no doubt about it. So I think I don't even have to justify my my point of view. However, we can still discuss it unless you try to prove that President Assad is a democratically elected ruler, right? Democratically elected president. Well, this anti-American and anti-Israeli attitude has been visible from since the very beginning. And obviously, it somehow positioned both the regime and the opposition at the very beginning of the conflict, right? So it was pretty clear that there will be for example, no alliance between Assad forces and the United States, and so on, right? Another factor which is of crucial importance in this case is sectarian division, or actually sectarian divisions in plural, especially between Sunnis and Alawi, but not only, including Sunnis and Alawi. There are quite many sectarian groups living in Syria, and we have to take these tensions between these groups into consideration. And finally, the last of these internal causes is a constant influx of foreign fighters to Syria, the process which is still ongoing, by the way, although obviously the scale is much lower than, for example, in 2013, 2014, but still that's a factor which has changed the situation on the ground. In the group of external causes, we have divergent interests of the main global powers. That is to say that there are differences between the United States, the People's Republic of China, and last but not least, the Russian Federation. And well, the conflict only only deepen these divisions and the rivalry in the Middle East region. I will come back to that, talking about consequences of the conflict, of the internationalization of the Syrian conflict. The second factor here is the rivalry or the competition between regional powers, and I can name three biggest regional players in this case, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Republic of Turkey. Well, last but not least, we cannot really forget about the role of non-state actors. No, well, I'm looking at Professor Ożarowski right now. Every time I say Hezbollah, Professor is on my mind, because Professor Ożarowski wrote a book about Hezbollah once. So we have to point to Hezbollah. I mean, the Lebanese Hezbollah, al-Nusra Front, namely Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, so the offspring of Al-Qaeda, and finally Daesh, namely the so-called Islamic State. The reason why I've mentioned these terrorist organizations, or organizations, if you like, is that they are sponsored by some states. It's pretty clear in the case of Hezbollah. It is clear to some extent in the case of Jabhat al-Nusra. It is less visible was less visible in the case of Daesh. However, we had some evidence that the group, at least in the past, was supported by some mercenaries from, for example, Saudi Arabia. I'm not saying that the king was involved, right, or the Saudi government, but still there were like mercenaries, namely citizens of Saudi Arabia, that were involved in this process, and they supported the group financially. Well, as far as consequences are concerned, again, we can divide them into three groups. So I specified social, political, and finally economic consequences. So among social consequences, I mentioned this demographic dimension. So, well, after 10 years, because the conflict has been ongoing for like 10 years right now, we have documented cases of more than 500,000 victims. We can add 13.4 million refugees to this number, including 6.7 million people who are internally displaced. Another factor is a huge loss of human potential, because usually analysts or scholars do not focus on this factor. But well, we should bear it in mind that all those people who are refugees, who have already left Syria, most of them will never come back home. So this way, Syria has lost some of its future potential, I mean, demographic potential, and that's the factor which will probably be visible in all demographic statistics till the end of the century. Limited or no access to education, it's a very sad thing. While children who are refugees, who live in refugee camps outside Syria, are provided with basic education, most of those internally displaced children in Syria have actually in practice no access to education, and it's a huge gap in educational gap in their lives. Another factor, the consequences of which will be visible in coming decades. In the case of political consequences, the conflict only deepened internal divisions. Another thing is that it strengthened regional alliances, and at the same time, it became a kind of proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. At the same time, the conflict increased tensions between Russia and the West. And finally, talking about economic consequences, well, it is estimated that the total cost of damage at the moment is, watch out, $1.2 trillion US dollars, not billion, $1.2 trillion US dollars. That's the cost of damaged infrastructure, demolished houses, cities, and so on. Well, enormous damage to infrastructure and houses. Well, I bet everybody has seen pictures of, for example, Aleppo and the city center of Aleppo, which is actually in ruins. Well, the accumulation of these costs may reach 1.7 trillion US dollars by 2035. And here comes the main, probably the most important question with regard to economic consequences. Who's gonna rebuild Syria, right? Who's gonna pay for that? That's something what I will leave for our discussion. Well, in conclusion, I would say that the conflict in Syria is still one of the most complex conflicts in the world, and difficult to settle, especially due to the demonstrated very high level of internationalization. There is this direct and indirect involvement in the conflict on the part of state actors, which resulted from the will to secure particular political and economic interests at the expense of Syrian society. External interference only deepened internal divisions and contributed to further radicalization of attitudes. Well, over time, the catalog of divergent interests of the parties involved has become so extensive that in practice, it is impossible to reach a lasting and comprehensive peace agreement. Thanks to direct or indirect help from state actors, also non-state actors, especially terrorist organizations, influenced or internationalization of the conflict in Syria by recruiting and transferring thousands of foreign fighters from different regions of the world to the territory of this country. Thus, in my opinion, the only way to end the conflict remains that the content of the agreement will be drafted by the directly interested parties representing only the Syrian pro-government and opposition forces. Thank you very much for your attention. Microphone?
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Professor Olesiewicz, for an interesting presentation. Listening to Professor Olesiewicz, I know that she recognized the category of political correctness. Why? Because especially when we say we don't know who and why, for me it's a political correctness, so it's okay, Przemek. Some of my comments, when I think about the conflict on Syria, I go back to 2011, the Arab Spring. The implementation of the Anglo-Saxon vision of the world led to the tragedy of Libya. This is my point. Is Syria not another example when I'm thinking about Syria? When we are talking about the Syria crisis and the Syria domestic war? Of course, in Syria, players are also regional ones: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, as Professor Olesiewicz said. But when we are going back to the Arab Spring, it's begun in this time, 2011 Arab Spring and the consequences of Arab Spring. When it comes to the economic consequences of the conflict in Syria, it's about 3 billion, yes, 3 billion, Przemek? American dollar, US dollars.
You mean the total cost?
Yes, the total cost. Okay, 3 billion of US dollars. I wonder what are the costs of introducing democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan after 20 years of American European activity in Afghanistan. The American President Joe Biden said that America and European allies didn't came to Afghanistan for working for democracy. It was a surprise for me. This is my comment. Who is going to say about the economic consequences of Iraq and the economic consequences, costs of Afghanistan? Okay, the next one is, who is the next one? Professor Żarowski. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for invitation for the conference. You hear me? Yes, everything is fine.
Yes, we
Okay.
hear you. We hear you.
Okay, I'd like to just in brief wanted to share with you some reflections on the Lebanese position regarding the international area, and also regarding the internal politics. Because when we talk about the Syrian war, when we just talk about the turmoil in the Middle East in general, usually the Lebanon in current times is somewhere in the background, but it's not visible, and it's not the topic of discussion to great extent as as Syria is, or as Iraq, or some Iranian and Saudi tensions are. And that's why I decided just to share some reflections on the situation in Lebanon, which is really dramatic. I'll start with this description of the position and situation in the Lebanon, and then I'll try to present some vision of possible ways of situation for the Lebanon, and in the future how it's going to function in under these circumstances which Lebanon might faced with at this moment. So let me start with some political and social background. First of all, Lebanon is a state victim of this what happened in Syria for a long period of time. At this moment, over 2 million refugees lives in Lebanon, in refugee camps or outside the refugee camps somewhere in the state, in many different places. And officially 1.5 million refugees is registered, but unofficial amount of the refugees is regarded over 2 million people. So it's dramatic information for any state which was forced to accept, to absorb such a big amount of population. If we take into consideration that Lebanese population is 4.5 million people, so can we just imagine 2 million extra refugees? It's definitely must affect breaking the older system and breaking down all the system. Yes, so that's why Lebanon is at this moment, and of course since many years, is in the humanitarian crisis, because the country and the state institutions are not able to supply with basic goods, drinkable water, and to guarantee the refugees the minimum level of the existence. So this is the one of the most important factor affecting the Lebanese situation. However, it's not the only one. Lebanon, since its beginning, actually, when the country was independent and or has become independent, was shaped in the form of sectarian and confessional system, which was through the few decades, actually, until the 1975, when the civil war started, was described as a golden mean for some religious and ethnic mosaic. However, in current times, it's rather a burden for the Lebanese politics and the Lebanese system, because this sectarian system blocks effectively, unfortunately, any possibilities of implementing the reforms, political, social, and economic reforms. And the example, I mean, there's sufficient proof for that. It was after the very notorious event when the massive explosion had taken place in Beirut in 2020. Afterwards, the Prime Minister of Lebanon resigned, but for over a year he was a caretaker of Prime Minister. Because the political forces in Lebanon couldn't reach an agreement in order to nominate or to just make a compromise to one person which could be a prime minister after the resignation of Mohamed Diab. Currently, Lebanon has Prime Minister Najib Mikati had another chance to form a government, but over 1 year there was a vacancy on this post, and that's why the Diab was a caretaker of prime minister. And of course, Hezbollah, which was involved in war in Syria, is another factor, destructive factor in Lebanese politics, because Hezbollah is part of the government since 2005 and can also decide about the Lebanese internal politics. However, it can take an autonomous decision to take part in external conflict with no any agreement of Lebanese state. So actually, it's obvious that the Hezbollah, since many decades, even works in Lebanon as a state within a state, and that's why it has also a destructive impact on the Lebanese politics and on the political stage, which also is connected with the economic and social aspects. However, passing quickly to economic aspects in Lebanon. The Lebanon is in a huge crisis. According to the World Bank, this year Lebanon is an example of the country which must face with one of the biggest economic crises in the world. So I'll just present some data. The GDP of Lebanon decreased in 2021 to $20 billion. But 3 years ago, it was estimated at $55 to $55 billion. So it almost decreased around 1/3 of this GDP taken from, in comparison to the 2018. So the real GDP actually fell by about 37%. It's of course connected with the conflicts, with the tensions, and political and economic instability. This GDP decline is associated with the devaluation of the Lebanese currency. So the Lebanese currency is losing its value from one day to one day. And that's why the US dollars are in current use, and just in Lebanon. Inflation rate, by the way, reached 144% in September 2021, and 78% of population actually lives below the poverty line. I don't need to comment this because it speaks for itself that Lebanon is facing a huge economic crisis and dilemmas. And what's more, actually, the pandemic also hit the economy of Lebanon because of the possible income from tourism. And Lebanon, since many years, was a tourist country. And when the pandemic broke out, all the tourist facilities couldn't be attracted by a lot of potential people, potential tourists, which were obliged to stay at home and couldn't travel to the Middle East, to Lebanon in particular. And what's more, just actually one of the big feature of Lebanon is rampant corruption. According to a corruption perception index from 2020, so this is the last report, Lebanon is ranked at 149th place among such countries like Bangladesh or Central African Republic. So it's another proof for the economic crisis and the unstable economic and political situation. So it was connected with the persistent social protest over the country because of the deteriorating situation in terms of economy and the just standard of living. That's why the best description for such a situation is that the Lebanon is a dysfunctional state with actually facing the collapse of the country. And what about the future of Lebanon? The situation is dramatic, it's horrendous, and it seems to be there is no way out from this crisis, and it drives to nowhere, actually. Even some experts say that a government is not able to control the situation anymore. And even if the government will change or in the future, the situation is so hard to such a great extent that it's not possible to just in a quick way to come back to a right track of repairing, rebuilding, reorganizing this economy of Lebanon and political stage. So, according to some also experts, they usually say that the future plans for Lebanon are rather negative because Lebanon is too small and too weak state to have a possibility to refrain from external influence. After the Syrian war, or when Syria has become a state torn by the war, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia increased in the country. And of course, the rivalry is an example when the external influence is of many countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia is proceeding at the expense of the Lebanese community, Lebanese ordinary people. So they care about their own interest, of course, to try to strengthen the influence in Lebanon at the expense of potential rival, and also at the expense of just Lebanese community. So US also is trying to keep the Lebanon in its own orbit. For instance, is trying to deliver some assistance to Lebanese army, and in this year it was actually increased to 120 million US dollar. US dollars. It's maybe it's not enough just to keep the Lebanon on its own orbit, but it's something that US believe that maybe Lebanon will not go or will not be in some zone of influence of a hostile country like Iran, for instance. And another question which arises is that it's connected with the Syria, and the question is whether Syria can regain its influence in Lebanon in the future. Of course, there is a big possibility and probability for that, but it would be done and would be achieved with the Russian help, definitely. So Syrian can reinstall once again its influence in Lebanon with the help of Russian Federation. Because of the situation in Syria, devastation, economically devastated country, and it's not capable to act in the Middle East and spreading the influence like it was before the war. So it could be done and only with the help of Russia in that case. So Russia somehow in this situation can be another player or another broker in Lebanon, using Syrian influence and using Syrians as intermediaries. And what about Israel at the end? Israel as a neighboring country, which still, of course, which still is in a state of the war with Lebanon, can strictly observe the situation in the country. We might ask, of course, if it's positive or negative for Israel, whether Lebanon will be more stable, if Lebanon will be more stable, or if Lebanon will be a country just coming strictly to fall or to collapse. The answer is that Israel might just watch at this moment and is concentrated on the Hezbollah activity at first. However, unstable Lebanon, and with as a political training ground, yes, in these aspects of spreading the influences, extending the influences by Iran and Saudi Arabia, and even in different countries, it's not a positive vision for the Israel. I think the Israel would prefer some more stable country, which would be more predictable for them. And then in this fact, it becomes another unpredictable threat in their northern border, as it was in the times of the war in Lebanon in 80s or even in the beginning of 90s. So just to conclude or to sum up, I think that the vision is rather negative for the Lebanon, and Lebanon will have as a country, we have a lot of dilemmas to overcome all these difficulties and to come back to the right track of economic and social development, alongside with political stabilization. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Allow me a short comment. Lebanon was recognized as the Switzerland of Middle East. as I remember. Beirut was like Las Vegas. For many years, was considered an example of compromise between Muslims as Christians in the Middle East. It was a very special compromise, just like in Yugoslavia over the years. We had war in Balkans, we have war in Lebanon. When we are talking about lost control state, the state that lost control began in the 70s. Then after Black September, 1917, Jordan, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, refugees came to Lebanon. But Palestinians moved from Jordan to Lebanon with the army, which was called PLO. Refugees from Syria, they are not organized as Palestinians before. They are not armed. When I'm thinking about today compromise, and when I'm thinking about today's situation in the Middle East regarding to Afghanistan, I'm thinking that perhaps Hezbollah will be in a similar situation to the Taliban in Afghanistan today. Who knows? This is the questions. What's going on with Hezbollah? As we know, Hezbollah is good organized. Hezbollah has had support. Hezbollah guarantees social support to the society. So what's going on in the future if Hezbollah will be recognized as a political power, is going to play the same role as Taliban in Afghanistan? Maybe they will govern. Who knows? Thank you. The next is, let me say, the next is Professor Bieniek. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, dear Professor Nowak, and please let me express my gratitude for being here with you in Poznań. This is the second time online and hopefully the last time online. Ladies and gentlemen, my topic is the Turkish post-coup d'etat foreign policy towards the Middle East, and basically to say I'm arguing that together with growing authoritarian tendencies in Turkish domestics, the country's attitude towards the Middle East shifted from, let's say, somehow chaotic and unilateral actions to attitude which is first based on a strong sense of national interest. And on the other hand, the whole region became also an important point of reference for Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in creation of bonds between his electorate and his political party and in Turkish domestics and country's foreign policy. So I have two basic questions. The first one is how Turkish foreign policy changed after the coup d'etat attempt of 2016, and another one, what's the Middle East role in the current Turkish foreign policy making? First of all, let me say that Turkish foreign policy became highly personalized by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This is clearly visible since the traditional houses such as National Security Council, military and foreign ministry, they lost the previous influential position and they retained only some auditing and let's say implementing roles. Second important issue is that the foreign policy became an extension of partisan domestic politics for the purposes of being victorious at home in the eyes of government and loses in the perspective of opposition. I will refer to this point later on. And the third issue is that diminishing roles of the traditional institutions, all these together, they paved the way for rise of personalities in Turkish foreign policy making, and obviously clearly now this is totally determined by the Recep Tayyip Erdogan, since his political leadership relies on the choices of the ruling party and supporting clientery, the personal preferences of him determine a governmental line and also the foreign policy, making. It is really interesting to observe how after this 2016 coup d'etat attempt, we can see, let's say, the change in the discourse of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This started even before the coup d'etat attempt. However, afterwards, after 2016, it got more and more impetus, and this discourse has changed, has transformed from, let's say, conservative democracy to the nationalist conservatism. This is now clearly seen in the foreign policy making, and Turkish foreign policy received its share from harsh and conflictual discourse of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It is also clearly visible according to his dealings with the political leaders. So somehow it is also with the reference to the Middle East, since somehow he is able to create a really good and close ties and relations with some particular Middle Eastern leaders, like, let's say, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad of Qatar. On the other hand, he easily condemns particular and destroys and actually damages seriously Turkish relations with several countries, like it was clearly evident in case of Egypt and his criticism of Sisi or Assad in Syria, and also, let's say, cornering Prince Salman after the Qashqai murder in Saudi Arabia. So this kind of foreign policy making, which is based strongly on the personal preferences, is also clearly visible when we are dealing with the Turkish attitude towards the Middle East. Another important issue is to underline the changes in the political structure of Turkey that are currently determining the Turkish foreign policy making. These are clearly visible after 2017 constitutional referendum, and also after June 24, 2018, the presidential and parliamentary elections that had made Recep Tayyip Erdogan actually president of the Republic of Turkey. We can indicate here just briefly, with no losing of the time, some important constitutional proceedings, and the first important is that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he minimalized the political and institutional authority of the ministries. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not so important anymore as it used to be in the past. Now these ministers, they changed, somehow they transformed their functions into the appointed technocrats, appointed obviously by the Recep Tayyip Erdogan. They are lacking the political mandate of parliamentary representation. The second important issue is that the presidential palace was transformed into the epicenter of the foreign policy making, with several new institutions, with several new bodies, like, for instance, the Security and Foreign Policy Council, which has the mandate to formalize alternative policies and coordinate the foreign policy of Turkey, obviously according to the will of the president Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And the third important feature of this new political structure, of this new political system, is that the president Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he's utilizing his ultimate authority to appoint top bureaucrats. This is the case of the ambassador of the Republic of Turkey, also in the countries of the Middle East, and this is the case of his advisors. He now is estimated to have, let's say, around 20 or 25 foreign policy advisors, like Ibrahim Kalin, who is really influential. However, we can have no doubts that the foreign policy also towards the Middle East is strictly in his hands, and it is somehow unpredictable in many aspects. Now I would indicate the three features of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's foreign policy and the Middle East's role within, since at the very beginning I said that he is utilizing the foreign policy with a view to achieve something domestically. This is basically something he is doing since 2002. However, I would argue that now in the current reality of Turkey, and also talking about the Middle East, this is ongoing and tendency that is becoming more and more important in the political discourse of Turkey. So first of all, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is having the vision of new Turkey. This is the conservative and majoritarian vision of a new Turkey, and in this scenario, foreign policy plays a critical role in bolstering domestic political support for the implementation of this vision. He is perceiving, I think, himself and Turkey as a key country, as a key player in the Muslim world and a key player in actually the global south, while saying such a popular slogans like the world is bigger than five, etc., etc. And this is the approach which sharply contrasts with the previous proceedings in the history of the Republic of Turkey since 1923. Another interesting issue when we are discussing Turkey's attitude towards the Middle East is to see how he is exploiting Turkish interventions and Turkish proceedings in the Middle East with a view to prove something and to show something to his supporters. What I basically mean is that the Middle East became a natural playground for Recep Tayyip Erdogan and really their unilateral actions, like the interventions in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. And when we take a look on the timing of these particular actions, especially in Syria, like the Operation Euphrates Shields of 2016 or the military intervention in 2019, it is always overlapping with some source of domestic crisis. In 2016, the Operation Euphrates Shield has been started just after the military coup d'etat attempt of July 2016, and in 2019 he is also carrying this operation with a view to have his electorate focus on this, not on the ongoing economical crisis in Turkey. Another issue is that I'm arguing that still in Turkish foreign policy making, especially towards the Middle East, we can clearly see something which is called a Severus syndrome. It basically means that for every loss inside, for every problems inside, somebody else is to be blamed, and this is often related to the Middle East. I'm lucky enough to be twice this year in Turkey, and obviously this is not a proper scientific resource. However, when you talk to ordinary people in Turkey and discussing the economical crisis with them, like 1 lira losing almost 10 or 12% to euro in one night, they are saying, no, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is saying that this is done by somebody else. This is not a problem of Turkish economy. This is the problem that we are the Middle Eastern country, and the basic answer here is that Israel, which is speculating on our lira. This is really popular discourse in Turkey, and the press, and also the pro-government TV like TRT. It often emits the shows which are the broadcasts that are supposed to stretch this way of thinking, that Israel is blamed for the crisis in Turkey economy, which is serious, which is simply to say not true. And the third element of domestic politics in use of the foreign policy is to fragment and weaken the opposition in Turkey. I'm arguing that this is quite clearly visible. Now Erdogan has serious domestic problems, and his mandate is really fragile. So he's trying to divide opposition while playing something in the foreign policy towards the Middle East. The case is actually that every Turkish political party, even the main oppositional forces like CHP or İYİ Partisi, they are highly nationalistic. The one which is not is the Kurdish party HDP, and Turkish extensive military involvement in Syria generated a little criticism. The political parties of Turkey are criticizing Recep Tayyip Erdogan domestically. However, when we are discussing the Turkish operations in Syria, nobody is daring to say anything. So the Kurdish party, the HDP, is somehow isolated in this context, and this is the way he is utilizing the foreign policy towards the Middle East with a view to achieve something domestically. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I would like to say that the Turkish perspectives on the Middle East and are rather blurry. Now, according to my opinion, Turkey does have only one proper ally in the Middle East. This is Qatar, and the country is still isolated. The country is isolated in every aspect, in the Balkans, in the relations with Europe, with Israel, with the US, and also in the Middle East. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in the way he's performing his foreign policy towards Middle East, he can say that he is, let's say, the personification of the Muslim world, but he is really highly unpopular in several Arab countries, and like, for instance, in the United Arab Emirates. So I don't think that in the reasonable future that Turkey will become a really active player in the Middle East. Of course, it is still powerful enough to implement some unilateral actions like they do in Syria. However, everything does have its limits. So I think that in this context, Turkey also will remain isolated in the Middle East. However, the most important context for me, since I'm dealing with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his political leadership, is that Middle East is really, really convenient and good area for Recep Tayyip Erdogan to be utilized with a view to show something to his electorate domestically, especially now when his position inside the political system is fragile. And this is actually the first time he may be really, really afraid of losing his power. Now they are starting to manipulate with the terms of the elections. They are supposed to be in 2023. However, I have followed on TRT the broadcasting which says that most probably they will be done earlier. So this is something that may again provide him with unlimited power for another 5 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I will stop here since I don't want to take much of your time, and I will be really happy to answer your questions and answer in the Q&A session. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for interesting presentation. The topic is very important, especially when we are talking about the Middle East. Many argue that the military coup is orchestrated by the authorities. So authoritarian power needs crises, and such a scenario is very good for such a countries, for such a power. The problem is, does this scenario help the country's development or not? When I'm thinking about Turkey, Turkey is an undisputed regional power, member of NATO. It's a technological power, military power. We didn't recognize how advanced, for example, military technology sector in Turkey is today, especially when I'm thinking as a Polish origin. We are also the members of NATO, but we didn't produce F-16. We didn't cooperate with F-35, but Turkey did. For me, Turkey tries to rebuild the traditions of the Ottoman Empire. Is it threat or not? I don't know. The problem is what argues Turkey will use in the Middle East. When you are talking about the relations with Israel, Turkey always cooperate with Israel. Especially when I'm thinking about military cooperation. Officially or unofficially, sometimes it was difficult because of the political reason to cooperate with Israel officially, but it was always cooperation with Israel, especially when I'm thinking about Iraq case and Syrian case, when Israelis used Turkey territory for flight to Iraq or to Syria for destroying nuclear capacity of both countries. My point is that Turkey is a player in the Middle East. When I'm thinking about, for example, the Hamas case and Gaza case, when Turkey supported the Hamas regime in Gaza, when I'm thinking about Syrian engagement, Turkey engagement in Syria, they are regional players. This is my point. But thank you very much. We have more time for discussion. We have 20 minutes for discussion. So now time for discussion, for questions. Who first? Nobody? Okay, our colleague from Pakistan. The floor is yours. You are first.
Thank you very much. My question actually is directed to Professor Carol. How do you pronounce your name? Carol Bienek?
Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to say that contrary to Turkey's image in the Middle East, Recep Tayyip Erdogan happens to be very popular in Pakistan, and he is looked upon as an example of leadership. So my point of view may differ slightly from yours, but I just want to ask you one question that recently, not recently really, last couple of years, Recep Tayyip Erdogan has revived the traditions of the Ottoman Turks through Turkish dramas, and some of these have been dubbed in our local language here in Pakistan. They're extremely popular, and the feeling is that he wants the Turkish people as well as the Muslims of the region, although these programs, by the way, are banned in Saudi Arabia. They are there to revive in the minds of the people the glory of the Ottoman Empire. What is, sir, your opinion?
About the revival of the Ottoman Empire, this is what you mean? And
I mean the use of the television serials to impress upon the people of Turkey how great the Ottoman Empire was, and that perhaps they should strive to regain that kind of glory again.
Okay, I see. Thank you for this question, Professor Hari. Yes, I'm following the Turkish television quite often, and I'm following the Turkish series really often. And obviously, they are used as a tool of, let's say, Turkish soft power. They are producing so much popular shows like about the sultans, of the 16th century when the Ottoman Empire was in heyday, and also about the late Ottoman Empire from the 19th century. This is actually what I was describing in my presentation as well. When you take a look at the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, it was really the state of collapse and devastation. So this is a kind of show they are broadcasted in Turkey with a view to show how powerful we were and how the foreign power managed to destroy us. They are somehow ridiculous. When I was in Turkmenistan, I was following the series about the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and there's a scene in which Sultan Abdul Hamid II is slapping the the English diplomat into his face. It's something ridiculous. It's something that would never take place, but it goes and clearly a signal for the Turkish public. Look how great he was. Look how good Sultan he was. He wanted to defend the Ottoman Empire. Sure, it was the Sultan who tried to unite this empire according to Islam, according to faith, for various reasons. However, of course, these kind of popular shows are sent abroad, and they are supposed to show how powerful Ottoman Empire was and why it collapsed. They are popular in particular parts of the world, but some of them are highly unpopular in the Arab world, especially the Arab world, in which Ottomans used to rule for several centuries. The Ottoman Empire is not popular in the countries they used to govern in the Middle East, like in the Northern Africa and the Arab Peninsula. So this is somehow failure of this kind of way of thinking. When I'm thinking about this idea of revival of the Ottoman Empire by Turkish politicians in the 20th century, I see one basic failure in this process. The Ottoman Empire was really was an empire with resources.
Turkey does not have such resources to become such an international player in the world as it would like to be. This is basically the answer to your question, and I will stop here. Thank you for this question. Is it fine for you this kind of answer? Okay.
No, thank you so much. I wanted your opinion, and thank you so much for your candid thoughts on the subject.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I think now time for Professor Żarowski. Am I sure or not?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Nowiak. I have basically I have two questions. First question is to Professor Sultan Ali. I'd like to just know if, because you concentrated on this positive aspect in the relations between China and Pakistan, which is obvious. I understand that China is one of the most important economic and political partner of Pakistan in current times. However, could you just mention a little about these dilemmas between the Pakistan and China at this moment, or some negative elements, if they exist, of course. So this is my question. Just what kind of dilemmas are in this moment are between the Pakistan and China, and how the Pakistani government and people sees this, if this exists, of course, to a greater extent.
Okay, thank you so much for asking this. Stephen Solars, the US thinker, he was once asked at a seminar in Washington about which two countries have the closest relationship. And the audience was expecting that he's going to say Israel and the USA. But his response was China and Pakistan. And then he went on to explain why China and Pakistan are so close. And his explanation was based on the fact that this is not a transactional relationship, but it is based upon very concrete connections, very concrete relationship. So coming back to your question, I personally think that there are no negative aspects between the Pakistani and Chinese relationship, because it dates back to 1949, when China got its independence. And after that, there were very few countries which recognized mainland China, but Pakistan was one of the first ones. And Pakistan was also instrumental in bringing the USA and China together. Pakistan organized the clandestine visit of Henry Kissinger. Then he was the national security advisor to Beijing, and then President Nixon came and visited, and everything changed. China has not forgotten that for 25 years, it was ignored by the world, but Pakistan was its only window of hope. And now that China has progressed to a state where it is the second biggest economic power, and Pakistan somehow has not only failed to reach it to its true potential, but it has fallen behind. So under these circumstances, the one country which really reaches out to Pakistan to support it through economic programs is China. So that is why it is very welcome and it is very popular in Pakistan. But having said that, you see, there are apprehensions in the minds of some people that maybe China is the new East India Company. And I'm sure you're a student of political science and history, that you would know the role East India Company played in the Indian subcontinent. But this is mainly looked upon as a propaganda by the detractors of China, who want to create a wedge between the people of Pakistan and the people of China. Because please remember that China has, especially in the area, my topic was COVID. And when COVID-19 struck, the first person or the first head of state which visited China was the president of Pakistan, who, despite the COVID restrictions, flew to Beijing and offered his help to the Chinese people. Not that they needed it, but it was, a symbolic thing. And the Chinese, they haven't looked back. They, of course, helped Pakistan out tremendously, not only economically, but by sharing their experience and so on. And even in the, bleak days of the COVID, the projects of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative, they continued. So they provided a sort of sustenance for the people of Pakistan. So I personally think that there are no negative areas, but time and again, we do hear some propaganda, which is, dismissed as something which the detractors of China would probably like to create. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Now everything is clear. Can I have ask for another question? Just
yes, of course.
Okay, I wouldn't be myself. I didn't ask Professor Oshevich about Syrian topic. Just one short question. Do you believe that Syria can, as a consequence, first of all, as a consequence, Syria is out of the all these playing games in the Middle East, probably for a lot of years. But do you believe in the future Syria independently can regain the influence in Lebanon, or will be able to regain the influence in Lebanon, which is regarded actually, Lebanon as a historical zone of influence, Syrian zone of influence. What's your opinion about this?
Well, thank you, Professor, for your question. First, I think that it's for the moment it's very unlikely, because even the Syrian regime, President Assad and his followers, they have their own problems at home, right? So the regime is not strong enough. It's not as strong as, for example, in the end of the 20th century. So I think that's the main reason why it is very unlikely for the moment. And second, well, as you know, much will depend on the situation in Lebanon. Well, obviously, we know that there is in comparison with the situation, for example, 10 years ago, there is a kind of chaos. There is an economic crisis, a financial crisis. So Lebanon is for sure much weaker. It's a much weaker state than it used to be in the past, but still, I'm quite optimistic that I see the future of Lebanon in brighter colors than the future of the Syrian state, right? Well, whatever we say, and I know that you are an expert on the Lebanese affairs, and you know it better than I do, but still, I think that Lebanon experienced such crisis in the past. Just not to mention the war in the 1980s. Still, they managed to somehow find a good way out from this situation. And I'm quite optimistic that they, even in this situation, during the economic crisis, they will find a way out of the current turmoil, of the current crisis. The last thing Lebanon needs for the moment is any kind of Syrian interference in internal affairs of this country. A big question mark here is what will major powers do in this case? Will they try to interfere in the Lebanese affairs or not? And here is that's the only factor which can be quite disturbing in coming years.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so maybe I will have one to Professor Sultan Ali. As we know, the involvement of US and EU has ended in Afghanistan. It ended in a fiasco. Before it was the same fiasco with Soviet Union. And the question is, could Chinese involvement in Afghanistan be better, be successful for ordinary people? I'm thinking about the society of Afghanistan. What is your opinion about?
Well, thank you so much for asking me this question. And it's a very important question. Now, you see, you've got to look back at history. Very briefly, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was for a totally different reason. And the US-led invasion of Afghanistan was again for a slightly different reason. The Soviet Union, of course, wanted to, capture Afghanistan, and perhaps they wanted to progress forward and reach the warm waters of the Atlantic Ocean, which was once upon a time the dream of Peter the Great. They were stopped in their tracks, and one of the countries that was instrumental in stopping the Soviet incursion, of course with the help of Pakistan and a number of other countries, was the USA. But you see, in 2001, when 9/11 occurred, it was the United States which wanted to attack Afghanistan, and it took over with the help of NATO forces. But in the 20 years that the United States remained there, and it spent a lot of money, it also sacrificed a lot of its people. But end of the day, it was unable to change the mindset of the people, and the Taliban, who were ousted, are now back into power. So it's a question of, deja vu, and perhaps ample lessons were not learned. Now, this is where the Chinese thinking comes in, which is slightly different. And I've been talking to Chinese diplomats and to a number of Chinese defense experts, because I contribute to Chinese television channels as well as magazines. I've asked them the same question. How do you think your support to the Afghan people is going to be different from the Soviet or the US example, which unfortunately ended, as you rightly pointed out, in a fiasco? The Chinese say that we do not have the ambitions, first of all, to bring democracy to Afghanistan. We are not interested in that. We are not interested in, changing the mindset of the people. Yes, we do not like extremism. And of course, one of the reasons is that, there is a serious problem in the Chinese province of Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs, there was an uprising, they have been suppressed, and now there are aspersions that probably the Chinese are prosecuting them. Although I've been to China many times, my own view is different. But the fact is that some of this extremism comes into Xinjiang from Afghanistan. And these were people who participated in the jihad. They were mujahideen, they became extremists, and now they have come back to Xinjiang and they're creating problems. So China's basic interest is to plug that gap, to make sure that the extremism doesn't travel into the Xinjiang province, to safeguard its own interest over there. The other thing is that there is a lot of potential in the Afghan region as far as minerals and other things are concerned, which the Chinese would like to help. And also there are numerous projects, including the Belt and Road Initiative, into the Central Asian states, which route through Afghanistan. Of course, there are direct routes from China also, but through Afghanistan, it will be a great help, especially, building the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which will enable the Afghans to make full use of it. So the Chinese want it to be a trade relationship and nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with, changing their style of democracy or their working. So that is where they believe, and I tend to, agree with them about 70%, that they perhaps may be more successful than the Soviet or the Americans.
I mean, especially to the ordinary people, to the society of Afghanistan.
You see, the people of China have been reaching out to Afghanistan, and the Taliban have traveled to China even before they came into power, and there have been a lot of exchanges, and the Taliban have promised China exactly what is being demanded by the USA or by the West, that the Taliban must tone down their extremism, and especially, not allowing the women to get education and so on. So the Chinese also have been demanding that. So the people of Afghanistan at the moment, they are starving, they are cold, they are hungry, and they are looking for aid from any source. And if the Chinese are promising them this kind of support, so they're actually welcoming it, rather than, being averse to it.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe we'll have
You're welcome.
the last minutes for Professor Żarowski. Are you going to ask one more question?
No, thank you, Professor.
Okay, because I checked the chat, so I thought that maybe you have one more question. So we are perfect on time. So I can say thank you very much for all of the participants. It was a very interesting, fruitful discussion. We have had only 2 hours. Maybe next time we need 4 or 6 hours because the topic is so important. Especially when we are meeting with such a group of the people which recognize the problems, which recognize the region. I mean that many people who try to discuss about regional problems in the Middle East, they didn't know anything about the region. They just used, as Professor Sultan Ali said, propaganda arguments, but we are not politicians. We are not people who use propaganda. I hope so that we are not such a people. So thank you very much once again for joining us, and see you next year. I hope that COVID will give us a chance to meet in reality, not just by internet. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like also to thank our distinguished panelists, and last but not least, Professor Wojciech Nowiak for this outstanding performance.
It was just
presiding the panel.
You know, I put this background because maybe the Western European American orders are like these birds. They are flying. Now it's time for Chinese.
Right. And there is also this special message for Sultan Ali, probably the biggest friend of Faculty of Political Science and Journalism. Sultan, dear friend, you know, the faculty is awaiting you next year. So inshallah, we meet here in person.
Yes, inshallah, inshallah.
Inshallah, I'm dying to come back to Poznan. I fell in love with Poznan when I came here 2 years ago.
I'm going to travel to Pakistan.
I'm not addressing Professor Ożarowski and Dr. Bienik because they are almost, you know, they are almost regarded as hosts of this conference. So
I'm going to travel to Pakistan. I have never been in Pakistan, but I know that Pakistan is a fantastic place because of the birds. And my hobby is bird watching.
Okay, so once again, thank you very much. And stay tuned for tomorrow's panels, because it was the last panel for today, but we are meeting tomorrow, and tomorrow is the second day of conference. So everybody's welcome. Meanwhile, stay safe, and I wish you a pleasant evening. So all the best, and see you soon.
See you. Thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. And Professor Nowiak, you are most welcome to Pakistan. Please contact me and I'll take you to some places where you can see some really rare birds.
I will. I hope I will. That coronavirus will give me such a chance to travel to Pakistan, because I know from many films, from many resources that Pakistan is a fantastic place for birds watching and so on. So I hope I will. It's the same in Cyprus, Wojciech. So I'm going to Cyprus too.
Cyprus is a perfect place for bird watching, you know, but you know, they hunt birds, you know, they kill millions of birds.
I know.
Migrating, you know, yeah. Now it's the hunting season, you know, and they really shoot madly.
It's crazy. It's the same like in Malta. It's a part of a culture. So we try to change this culture. I think it was some letters which were published and collects against this, but European Union didn't do anything. It's
okay.
It's sad for me. It's crazy for me, but
okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much. That was very interesting, you know, to watch and listen to your presentations. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and special greetings to Professor Poryszyński. in Warsaw. So special greetings. I mean, warm greetings from Winter Poznan.
Oh, Winter Poznan. My goodness, you know.
But without snow, so it isn't a Winter Poznan.
If I tell you that in Cyprus it's still like 20 Celsius, so we can feel jealous, you know. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good night. Have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Good day.
Bye-bye.
Good day, gentlemen.
Bye bye.